Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining me for another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today I will be talking about Season 2, Episode 17, My Brother Richard, starring Royal Dano as Martin, Inger Stevens as Laura, and Harry Towns as Richard. And this episode, in my opinion, is easily the worst episode of Season 2 so far, and one of the worst Alfred Hitchcock Presents episodes I have seen. Nothing about this episode really worked for me, unfortunately. The plot really has a lot of things about it that don't make a lot of sense. And the whole episode comes across as kind of overly dramatic, and nothing about it worked, including the ending, which is just one big plot contrivance, in my opinion. So, this episode starts with a man showering, and he is immediately killed. This happens literally within the first minute of the episode, which does give us. Get our attention, even if it's a bit abrupt. And we find out the man who did this killing was Richard. We'll find out more about him soon. Then we are introduced to Martin, one of our other lead characters, and his wife Laura, and it turns out Martin's a district attorney, and he's also going to be running to be a candidate for governor. So his brother Richard comes by. He's our killer, as we've already been told. And he tells Martin basically, you don't have to worry, you will be the candidate because I killed the other contender for the job. So Martin is having a hard time dealing with this, but it's confirmed to be true through a phone call. So basically, Richard and Martin talk, and Richard wants Martin to frame someone else, but Martin thinks ethically this is wrong, so he doesn't want to go along with it. But Richard decides he's going to force Martin to go along with it by pointing a gun at the wife Laura, who is given nothing more to do in this episode than stand around and look scared and cry. Her character is nothing more than that. Also, we're given some kind of weird motivations for Richard to be doing all this, but they didn't come across as believable, at least to me, when we find out a little bit more about his background. All the characters are very one note in this episode, in my opinion. So at this point, Martin and Laura talk. Laura is very scared, but Martin tells her to remain calm. He says to trust him, which I don't know if I would trust this guy based on some of his logic in this episode. I'll just say that. So Martin decides it's a good idea for them to just kind of sneak out and leave, which is actually a very bad idea when the other person in the house has a gun on you. So Richard shoots and he misses, I think deliberately. Who really knows though? So Laura falls over and she's scared, but she doesn't get shot or anything. So at this point, we go to the next scene, and we learn there's a suspect named Tommy. So Martin goes to pay him a visit, being the district attorney. They talk. We learn that this Tommy has a troubled past. But other than that, the motivation that this guy has, there's no real evidence against him. It's all circumstantial. It's very strange. They want him to sign a confession that he committed this murder, which really didn't make a lot of sense to me. It seemed like it's just something the plot needed to happen. So at this point, Martin talks to Tommy by himself, and he actually tells this kid to sign this confession as a plan because it'll make Richard let his guard down, and he figures he'll be able to save Laura that way, who's being held hostage by Richard at this point. And this kid surprisingly agrees to do this. Why? I don't know. It seems pretty risky. What if something with this plan doesn't work? Which, of course, it doesn't, being Alfred Hitchcock Presents. So at this point, Richard thinks he's in the clear. There's this long scene with him and Laura talking, but nothing really happens. It's just filler. She's still upset. He's bragging, acting strange like he always does. So Martin comes home and tries to put on an act and says, this kid, Tommy, confessed. So he tells Richard, you can leave now. But of course, Richard wants the signed confession first. So at this point, Martin gives it to him. But then Richard once again changes the deal. He says he's going to take Laura with him and he'll release her when this kid is executed. So at this point, he then decides to shoot Martin, or apparently shoot him. It looks like he shot. We'll find out more about that in a few minutes. This scene was kind of sloppy and didn't make a lot of sense either. So at this point, it looks like he's also ready to do in Laura. So at this point, the doorbell rings, and it turns out the mother, this character, the mother of Tommy, comes by. This character comes out of nowhere, and again, is just there so the plot can advance, basically. She pleads, thinking that Richard is Martin, and she says her son couldn't be the killer, but because Richard has no compassion and just rejects her, this woman suddenly pulls out a knife she had in her purse and stabs him. I'm assuming killing him, even though they don't really tell us this for sure. And then Martin magically wakes up. I'm not sure if he was shot and injured or if he was just faking or if Richard missed or what happens, but Martin's okay. He hugs Laura, and it turns out that their defense for this woman will be self-defense. And I guess the murder will be pinned on Richard. Like I said, a very contrived, unconvincing ending to an episode I just didn't like at all. Nothing about it worked for me. The acting is pretty good and saves the episode from being completely terrible. But overall, My Brother Richard is a failure in my opinion, and I'm going to give it a 1.5 out of 5. This is definitely an episode you can skip unless you're watching every single episode of the show. So 1.5 out of 5 for My Brother Richard, and as always, thank you very much for watching.